If you're an elder, you've almost certainly had the experience where you had one of the members come to you and say, what you really ought to be doing is this, only to have another member come and say exactly the opposite to you. And so it seems like all the time, half the people are aggravated at what you're doing. Maybe you have one group of people who say, what you really need to do is be concerned with the outsider and how we can reach people who aren't here yet. And that's the only thing we ought to be talking about. Only to have another group in your congregation say, you're always talking about the people who aren't here yet and how to get them here. How about the people who are already here? Is there some way to manage this so we don't just have winners and losers and half the people angry all the time? Is there a way to approach this problem so that we can manage these polarities rather than just wind up at each other's throats? I wonder.
Today our conversation focuses on managing polarities. And I have a special guest with me today, Ben Siburt. Ben, good to have you with us today.
Thanks, good to be here.
Ben, you've been in ministry for over a dozen years, leading congregations, and we have a mutual connection through your father, Charles Siburt. It's a special pleasure to have you here today to talk about managing polarities.
Thanks.
Congregational leaders engage in all kinds of challenges and problems that come up. Sometimes we call them problems. Sometimes there are conflicts that have to be addressed. And other times it's a little more subtle than that. It moves into questions that we might call today polarities. Why don't you unpack some of that for us?
Yeah, I think most church leaders understand the tyranny of the immediate, that there's always some fire to put out, some problem to try to solve. And I think in churches there are problems that have solutions that we can deal with. There are conflicts that can have resolutions that can be resolved through leadership. And then there's other things that don't have an easy answer like that have tensions on both sides that need to be managed. Mm-hmm. And so polarities are things that exist that need to be managed, you know. And
well, so you're saying that there are some things that are problems that we can find a solution for.
Right.
There are times when there's conflict and we seek resolution in those conflicts.
Right.
But then polarities are where there's something going on that what you're speaking about sounds like they're ongoing. We don't solve them, we somehow or another live with them.
Right. These are just tensions that need to be managed, and so you're finding a healthy balance between the two.
Okay, so does that mean that, so tensions, describe more what we mean by these polarities.
You know, I think one preacher says that you know these exist when you have two sides of something that have mature voices on both sides. And so this can be, you know, our church needs to really make sure that we're focused on people outside of our walls, that we're focused on taking cups of cold water to people, that we're taking the gospel to people, that we're sharing outside. And others that, you know, we need to make sure that we're really developing people in the faith, that we're growing them, we're reaching in so that people are growing in Christ here in our community of faith. Well, both of those are true. Do we focus outside? Yes. Do we focus inside? Yes. You know, there's management. You know, we've got to manage things. Bills have to be paid, structures have to be taken care of. But there's leadership into the future, visions for the future. What's God's preferred future for our church? There's traditions that need to be upheld, things that we've done for a long time that orient our people. But we also have to innovate to be relevant to the culture around us, to what God's doing today, to future generations. And all those are polarities, things that there isn't a solution for the balance between two. It's just leadership is finding a healthy balance.
So both things are true. Both are necessary for healthy congregations, and both live in some sort of relationship with each other.
Right.
Well, let's take one of those and play it out a little more. You mentioned the idea of reaching out and then taking care internally, discipleship or formation of a congregation or pastoral care.
Right.
Play that out for us a little more.
Well, I think the nature of church is that after a while, we tend to kind of focus in on ourselves. And so you always have to be diligent in making sure that we're reaching to those outside, that we're considering those, that we use language that a guest who's never been to church before could understand and could engage with, that we're making sure that we're thinking about people outside of our walls, that your budget reflects things inside as much as it does service outside of your budget. And so, for example, at Highland, when we cast a vision recently, it was part of that is restoring the world, it's restoring our city. And we wanted to make sure when we had a campaign to fund that vision, that 51% of the money we would raise would go outside of our walls and 49% would stay in. And the intent there was to find that balance that we've talked about, just in the budget, but in the mission of what we're trying to do, so that our resources are invested in much outside as they are with growing people inside.
Well, that's interesting to think about this, keeping the two polarities in balance with one another, not just in our conversations or our ministry, but even down to the way we spend our dollars.
Right.
One of the ways we could talk about this in-reach and outreach might come through thinking about the case study of the South Avenue Church. We have a mid-sized congregation that's got an element within the church that's saying it's time for us to reach out to the persons outside of us through social justice ministries. But then there's another segment of the church, and for a long time there's been this interest in a building expansion. So here's an elder group or a leadership group having conversations with these two forces at work, or two things that are on the table. How would you perhaps counsel that elder group to work through the polarity that's exhibiting itself in their conversation?
Right. I think it's exciting because it takes creativity, and I think it takes leadership and imagination. But it can be, for us, part of our vision was remodeling a 50-plus-year-old, 60-plus-year-old auditorium. And so we chose to do that and do it well, but not to do it to the extent that it could have been. We could have really spent a lot of money making that as nice as possible.
A palace.
Right. And it was nice, it's welcoming, it's functional, it's great. But we purposely set the budget at a certain level so that we could find that balance to where there is just as much money going to sharing and participating in what God's doing in the world as there is in spending on our own building. And so as we were going through that process, the people that were helping, a consulting group that helped us on that, was kind of like, well, this is rare. Churches typically do campaigns for buildings. And our hope was that in that process we were finding that balance. And we'd have people that would give us money and say, I want this to go to the chairs. It's time that we need new chairs. And we'd have other people give us money and say, I don't want one single of this dollar staying inside, I want it to go out. And we could say, yes.
We're doing both of those things.
Because they're both important.
Right. So with this group, out of your own experience, sounds pretty similar to the South Avenue Church. For this elder group, for them to both think about renovation or expansion of the building, but also find ways, concrete ways to engage their community would make a lot of sense. Thinking about that, isn't there some way in which actually doing both of those things sort of feeds the other in sort of a perverse sort of way?
Yeah, it does. It's exactly what happens. In that rhythm and balance, you find a healthy, vibrant church. And it's not easy. There is tension there when you have these two truths at work. And so that's where it takes leaders being consistent, being creative. And I think a lot of times in leadership, we kind of fall into this pattern of being guardians rather than just leaders. And part of leadership is to see the big picture and to manage these two truths well, so that your church does. If your church is embracing the neighborhood around it, more people are going to be involved in the life of your church, and that means more resources for buildings. And when your buildings are being used for the community around you, they do feed each other very well.
Yeah, it's like breathing in and breathing out.
Exactly.
Almost. They feed each other. That's good. Well, as I think about that, Ben, let me ask, if you were to develop a theological or a biblical rationale, is there a place that you could kind of point us to, give us some biblical imagination to think about polarities?
Yeah, I think the Gospel of Luke gives us a great example. I think we see this in the Gospels often, where stories are put next to each other to comment on one another and to teach us. And Luke does this in chapter 10 with the very familiar story of the Good Samaritan, which literally ends with this go and do likewise. You go and be this neighbor to those that are outsiders, and go and share and care for your neighbor. And the very next story is Mary and Martha, where Jesus tells her, quit worrying about all the details, just sit, Mary's chosen wisely. She's sitting at my feet and sitting at the feet of Jesus. So even in that gospel, we have following Jesus is going and doing, and it's also sitting and being still. And both of those are true. And so I think that's, as we strive as church leaders to find that balance, where we are following the way of Jesus, but there are times to manage, there are times to lead, there are times to reach out to those around us, and there are times to take care of the people in front of us. But we end up focusing in on one of those areas, and when we do, it sucks the life out of the rhythm and balance of the church.
Wow. Thank you, Ben. That's so helpful. This practice of leadership that is able, really on the front end, as we started this conversation, to be able to discern, is this a problem or is this a polarity, is a helpful fork in the road to negotiate. But then as we move into these conversations about polarity, to recognize that sometimes there are truths that stand in a creative tension with one another, becomes a helpful practice of leadership. Thank you for being with me today.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
As I was listening to this conversation, one of the things I was struck with is we hate polarities. We want it to be this way or we want it to be that way, but trying to honor both or live in the tension of both is really difficult and puts elders in a difficult position.
That's right. It's a lot simpler if it's just A or B. If it's both A and B, then that's a much more complex place to live.
Is it possible to do that? It's A and B?
Yeah, I think it is if we have the conviction that both A and B are true, and that the gospel calls us to live into both A and B, and that by living into both of those realities, that we live out the gospel more faithfully.
The example that Ben used in particular is whether we emphasize insiders or outsiders. And the truth is, in many of the churches that I visit, some of the sharpest tensions among leadership is over this topic. You have certain members of the congregation of leadership who want to do whatever it takes to do to reach that person who's outside and hasn't come in yet. And there are others who, we're already here. Where are we going to do things that are going to be aimed at people that aren't even here? We have to care for the people on the inside. And that's a very sharp tension. And I wonder what would happen if our listeners sort of went around the table and expressed their true sentiments about that. Are you more concerned about those who are on the outside or those who are on the inside?
And what would happen if we then thickened that pot by bringing ministry staff and other key leaders into that kind of conversation and placed ourselves on a spectrum between in-reach and outreach, and see the tension being played out by the various places we would inhabit on that line?
And if we assume that neither of those is right, that they're both right, would probably be the better way to put it. It would be interesting then to see, okay, how do our practices line up with what we say our commitments are? If we say we have commitments to outreach, are we actually doing anything to do that?
Can we identify those things?
How are those matching up?
Right. And then to take and ask, what is the attitudes of our congregation and how that plays into the mix of things as well. It's a complicated and yet fruitful kind of conversation if we're going to be leaning into the power of the gospel as it lives itself out in our congregation's life. Perhaps it's time to simply turn the conversation to you and have that conversation around your table.
He was a medical doctor, so he had a busy life, and he said, I'm resigning as an elder so that I have more time to shepherd people. Wow.
So these stories that are literally next to each other end with go and do likewise, and then sit and be still. And yes, those are both true.
you.